Hey, welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. We have with us Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Ms. Judith Hawkins, former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. And we also have with us Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, great having you here with us and looking forward to our show today. You know, there's an interesting mandate that's happening in Washington state where clergy are being told that if you are in the midst of confession and you hear something that's being told that is illegal, you may not be able to keep it confidential. A just and free society is one in which religious freedom is supposed to be protected. The Department of Justice's decision to investigate an anti-Catholic law in Washington state seems to be a new necessary step toward ensuring that the free exercise of religion and potentially eliminating religious discrimination from our nation's laws is necessary. Governor Bob Ferguson of Washington state recently signed off on a Senate bill that mandates that clergy report suspected child abuse or neglect, classifying them as mandatory reporters alongside professionals such as teachers and doctors. You know, when I see what's going on in this particular state, Bettina, one thing that I can't quite get my arms around is where do we draw the line between protecting the public and making sure that they are going to be in a position of safety as opposed to religious beliefs that sometimes seems to counteract that exact same law? Where do we go? How do we handle this?
What a question. I mean, I'm not Catholic, so the theological arguments around why that seal of the confessional, why that supersedes the duty to report child sexual abuse, I just don't understand that. I mean, that is beyond my understanding, but that is the nature of many religious freedom claims. Those looking on from the outside don't understand them. So as you ask, Gordon, what do we do with that? A society that takes religious freedom seriously, that takes child safety seriously. Well, the reality is that religious freedom is absolute in the sense that you can believe what you like, but there are a number of narrow situations where the right to act on those beliefs is not absolute, where the law, where a state can intervene. And so if a state has what's called a compelling state interest, it can limit, in some instances, your right to act on your beliefs. In this case, the right to keep the seal of the confessional completely intact.
Yeah.
And so preventing child sexual abuse, that's got to be a compelling state interest. But the rub is that even if the state has this interest, it still has to meet a really high legal threshold, known as strict scrutiny. It has to be careful that it's narrowly tailoring its approach in the least restrictive way possible. Another complicating factor here, Orlin, is that this law in Washington state, it completely gets rid of penitent clergy privilege, but it retains some exceptions for instance, attorney-client privilege. Now, the Supreme Court is going to take a really hard no on that, I think. But we can only wait and see.
And I think, Bettina, that's where I'm grappling with this, because I understand the compelling state interest in protecting children, but to say, okay, you know, confessions are not protected, but attorney-client privilege is. I just don't see how Washington is able to come to that as their narrowly tailored way of handling this. And as I looked at this, I saw that states have taken a variety of approaches on this, right? We have some states where everyone is considered basically a mandatory reporter. We have states where priests and other religious, pastors or religious leaders, they are mandatory reporters, but not when it comes to terms of like the confessional. We have states that just exempt religious leaders from mandatory reporting requirements altogether. And so I think that everyone's trying to grapple with where's the balance here of protecting children, this compelling government interest of protecting children, but at the same time respecting, this very central part of this faith tradition's a practice. Right, like we've heard of that priests can be excommunicated for violating this. So I mean, it is to me, even though I'm not a Catholic and I don't believe in the confessional, I understand that this is very central to many people's worship and understanding of how they relate to God.
And I think that Jennifer is a really good question for us to grapple with, right? When it's something that is not central to us as believers.
Yeah.
We recognize that it is for someone else. Mm-hmm. And then going back to the conversation that we have as far as the state's burden to protect its the compelling state interest, it does look as if a particular faith tradition is being targeted with a very specific piece of legislation, right? And then to have these secular, exemptions still, that's really tough as a religious freedom expert. But then the fact that as someone who is not Catholic, who doesn't, I have a hard time saying, yeah, but kids,
Yeah.
And so I really have to. I think it's a tough one for religious freedom advocates to wrestle with.
Well, having been a member of the Florida Bar for just about 40 years now, when I read this topic at first, I was grappling with it. But let me just make some observations here. I have dealt with these issues on a personal level. I've dealt with them as a GL appointed to represent the best interests of the children before the court. I have dealt with them as being the attorney for parents who were accused of abusing their children. I have issued orders, injunctions to protect children from abuse, and I have presided over cases where this is the underlying issue. And at some point, as a society, we have to finally decide who we're going to protect. And if we're going to decide that children who are the most innocent of victims without any ability whatsoever to speak up for themselves are not going to be protected by the state, but a person can have confidentiality in his confession. And this is an ugly statement I'm going to say, and I hope I don't get kicked off the show for saying it. But the Catholic Church has a long history, as it is being now disclosed, of all kinds of abuse against children in its ranks. I'm coming down hard that if we don't protect the children, if we do not, and I forgot to add one more thing, within weeks, just recent weeks, my fellow judge did not enter an injunction by the time it had gotten to her. And there's a 5-year-old child who's dead. All right. So this is not just a theoretical case for me. This case has real practical awareness. What kind of society are we if we're going to put the rights of an adult who is perpetrating these kinds of abuses on children over protecting the children? That says more about us as a society than it says about religious freedom. And I've got nothing else to say about this because I can tell, every now and then judges do have an emotional button, and I think this is one for me.
Wow. I mean, what you have just laid out there is just so compelling. And I think that makes the point even more clear that it is incumbent on state legislators when they're drafting these laws to draft them in a way that will make them effective.
Yeah.
And drafting them in a way that allows some professions to retain secrecy or confidentiality while not allowing a religious group to do so is a clear, I would say, malpractice of legislating.
Yep.
And so I agree. This issue is too important on both the religious freedom side and most especially the welfare of children, for us to mess around with, playing games and treating religious claims in a way that is lesser than attorney-client privilege.
I think the attorney-client privilege as a judge, where I've had the opportunity to call the balls and the strikes and to preside over cases where I knew the rest of the story. But our law, our system of jurisprudence says it's better for a guilty man to go free than for an innocent person to be convicted. And I think that that is the fundamental foundation of our jurisprudence. And therefore, the attorney-client privilege is not in the same category as this clergy privilege for in these abuse cases. And that distinction should always be there. Otherwise, you have lawyers not holding up the oath, which is that every person is entitled to a zealous defense. And by the way, if the state doesn't meet its burden beyond let me get off. I'm getting onto a soap opera here. I'm just going to get quiet.
Orlin, I was thinking of other examples. We all mentioned this is tough. Tough for us to wrap our heads around as believers because this is not our faith tradition and something that we. But I was thinking where we have seen a society draw that line, and it's with medical decisions, right, that are motivated by faith, right? We think specifically of blood transfusions. And we have seen consistently that the state has said, no, you cannot, this is not a religious freedom to endanger the health and safety of your child, of your minor child, right? And so I think that might provide some guidance, some jurisprudence guidance to lawmakers as they are sort of struggling with where to draw that line.
One thing I'll say, and Jennifer, this is the interesting part, when you talk about these type of matters, on one hand, you can have what I would call a neutral position on it, but when your child is the one that has a problem, there's nothing neutral about it anymore. And the reality is the closer this gets to home, it's more difficult for decision makers to decide what to do, because my guess is all of this is surrounding a specific activity that actually happened, which is why the legislature decided to do something. And I don't know how you take the personal concept out of this, Jennifer, or is it even possible?
I don't think it's possible, and I think what we all agree on here is that children, they are one of the most vulnerable groups of people here, right? And so the compelling interest, again, of protecting children from abuses occurring and being silenced because of maybe a misuse of the confessional or a misuse of attorney-client privilege, and both can be misused by individuals, right? Again, this is why so many states have been grappling with how to deal with this, and this is why there's so many different laws regarding who was a mandatory reporter, under what circumstances, and it really is so state specific, state dependent. And I always get concerned where we see, well, you have to report in this state, but you don't in this state. I feel like there should be a more national policy on things like this, so that people aren't able to do things in one state that they can't do in another.
Well, my prayer really is to get us to a position that we can make sure that we are looking out for the least of these, and in that category, children probably fall into that category, but somehow being able to still have some protective issues from a religious standpoint, but not when your religion looks like it may end up harming someone. In the case of Hensley versus State Commission on Judicial Conduct, we have a situation where a Justice, Dianne Hensley, is a justice of the peace in Texas who announced that due to her religious beliefs, she would not perform weddings for same-sex couples, but would refer them to others who would. The State Commission on Judicial Conduct ended up issuing a public warning for casting doubt on her capacity to act impartially due to the person's sexual orientation. And because she was in violation according to this particular group that's supposed to be in charge, the Special Court of Reviews came back and said, we want this to stop. You actually got to shut it down. And as a result thereof, they ended up being sued by the commission, and others decided that this was not the way to go. This is an interesting matter, Jennifer, where you have a judge who's saying, I don't think I should be ruling on this. However, I'm willing to send this to somebody else for them to rule on it. And what we have now is a body that actually regulates her activities, or the activities of the judiciary here, have determined, well, if you can't be impartial here, maybe you can't be impartial anywhere else. But in her mind, it sounds like she's saying, this is just my issue. I can't deal with this, so I'm recommending it to somebody else. Do we have judges now just basically picking and choosing what cases they want based on their own feeling? Or is this something that probably sounds like it was just common sense?
No, I think that, you're kind of hitting on the issue here. Here we have a justice of the peace who is not required to officiate weddings, right? But the issue here is that she's picking and choosing which wedding she is going to officiate. And even if she thinks in her mind that she's doing a good service by saying, hey, even though I, for religious reasons, do not feel comfortable officiating these same-sex marriages, I'm going to find a way for you to still get your marriage license issued. That landed her in hot water with the Commission on Judicial Conduct, because they're saying, hey, you're showing your bias here. You're showing that when certain people come before you, that you don't feel the same way about them. You're maybe not going to be objective when you handle matters from same-sex individuals. And so you have these two laws, right? You have the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct, which she's been, reprimanded for violating. And then here she comes with the Texas RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, saying, hey, you are infringing on my freedom of speech and religion by compelling me to have to issue these marriage licenses which go against my religious belief. And so you see these two laws coming into conflict. And this could have been avoided had she just taken the stance she's not going to officiate any weddings.
Right.
Point blank, right? Then this would have all been avoided.
I'm just sitting here thinking about this, Orlin, and I guess I would disagree as far as I do believe that an individual has the right to be able to say, this violates my conscience. And so I'm going to opt out of this particular function. That's something that I would stand up for. Though additionally, I guess I would say I looked at another case that's coming out of Texas that's followed right on the heels of this, right? Another state judge, Judge Umpris, who is also has actually also started a lawsuit against this same commission for this same reason, even though he has not been disciplined in any way. And it was interesting to me and troubling. And again, like Jennifer was saying, I think shows the hand of actually the overall goal of this is that he was suing the commission, arguing that he has a constitutional right to not officiate same-sex marriages. Again, I agree with that. And that same-sex couples do not have the constitutional right to get married. And so again, you're seeing with that second component, he's starting this lawsuit that it's part of a broader conservative project to erode the legitimacy of Obergefell, right? We're talking about civil legalities rather than moral when we're talking about state engagement in the marriage, and definitely this is something that is part of a much bigger strategy.
So Judge, go ahead, tell us, what are your thoughts on this?
My first thought is people. Anybody ever heard of accommodations? Nobody was complaining about this in the jurisdiction. The potential spouses were delighted that they were able to get married. She made it easy for them to do it, no cost. It was no big deal. It was working. Why mess with something that's working? Number two, I kind of think that she should have done what she did. And I had to think about, I'll make it personal. This was an issue that I had to deal with. And as I thought about it, I was trying to figure out what to do. And I will admit, my very first thought was, let me find other judges who have no problems with this. And then I said to myself, but if I do that, I'm probably going to come before the JQC, the Judicial Qualification Commission there in Florida, because chances are those same-sex marriage people, or those who are involved in same-sex marriages, are probably going to say, but we want Judge Hawkins to marry us because she's so good at it. So, but I thought that the way she handled it was resourceful, and I think if they had just left her alone, everybody's happy. Why bother? Why mess with something that's not broken? But now I also agree that there's a deeper agenda going on here. But there's one other thing we should pay attention to. This was back in 2019. And the lawsuit that she has now is coming after the commission for saying that it impugned her reputation and her ability to function. And I think that she should push that issue because there has to be some restraints on the people above us. This goes back to one of our shows where we talked about those in leadership are hosting and promoting religious meetings during the workday on state property. And so those who are in charge need to be checked by somebody.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard sometimes to check those who are in charge. That's not a very legal argument. It's not articulated well, but sometimes common sense is a good thing. It's not very common, but it's a good thing.
You're preaching my sermon there. I mean, common sense, that is really what's needed here. But the problem is we're in an environment of zero-sum battles. So we've got to have winners, we've got to have losers. It's my way or the highway. And working out sensible accommodations, as Judge Hawkins suggests, it's just not on people's radar. They're going to fight this out to the bitter end. I think of that piece of legislation that passed a few years back now, Respect for Marriage Act. And I don't remember the exact wording, but to paraphrase it, it's basically people of good faith. They can have different sincere beliefs about gender and marriage. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. These are opinions that are grounded in religious, philosophical convictions. And Congress recognizes these differences, and also recognizes that these differences deserve genuine respect.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of that should be our agenda setter right there, to recognize that in this great republic that we call America, there are going to be deeply, deeply held differences on very pivotal issues, emotive issues, but that the whole weight of American history and constitutional law says that we can find common sense solutions, accommodations for all of us to live together. So I think what we're seeing down there in that state, it's just symptomatic of this broader issue that's going to be festering for a very long time to come.
I appreciate that Bettina mentioned the Respect for Marriage Act, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church was involved in making sure that language that she mentioned was included in that piece of legislation. And I'm glad that it was. I think it achieved exactly what Bettina was saying, is a really mutually respectful, common sense approach to something. But it was not easy, as someone that was involved in those meetings and those conversations, to get that language in there. It was an uphill battle to make that happen. And it was from all sides. There are faith traditions and people of faith who very much believe this is something. I don't believe in same-sex marriage from my spiritual standpoint, my faith tradition. And so no one should have the right to do that because of my convictions. And so they, didn't want to, no sort of compromise language or amendment or anything like that, right? And then there are the individuals on the other side, the LGBTQ rights individuals, who are saying this is bigotry, right? People should not be allowed to not perform their job because of their religious. I agree with what Bettina said and the intent of the Respect for Marriage Act, the balance that it was able to come up with. And I hope that we will see more of that approach down the road, and really in all aspects of legislation. We're seeing this zero-sum game, as Bettina said, in all of our issue-based conversations, and it just it's not helpful for our country, right? And it's not helpful for our relationships with each other.
Yeah. But part of the issue I think we're seeing is the concept of right and wrong doesn't necessarily translate nicely to the concept of winning and losing. In my mind, the easiest way to demonstrate that you're a winner is by pointing out who the class of losers are. And if you point out the class of losers, then you make it clear that's not me. So I think part of the struggle we're seeing here is, and I'll use Judge Hawkins' favorite line, there may be a complete backstory going on as it relates to this judge in this particular circumstance that we may actually never really know, because winning and losing sometimes doesn't equate to right or wrong. And Judge Hawkins, you were getting ready to say something.
I was saying that what happened to the concept of win-win? Just literally, win-win. It's okay for us to coexist. You give a little, I give a little. And there are very few things in life that really require us to take a hard-nosed position. And that which we take a hard-nosed position really primarily is based on our religious orientation. But I hate to be the one to tell everybody listening, sometimes your hard line on some religious issue isn't exactly God's hard line on those religious issues. So you might want to put a little bit of elasticity in that too. Just saying.
Well, I think that's a good point, Judge, and I'm going to let that be the last word. One of the struggles that we have to deal with is when you see something that works for you from a religious standpoint, sometimes you have to pump the brakes, because in reality, wanting to understand how this may impact your fellow man is also just as important. But in this particular case, sometimes when something is working, maybe we just need to let it alone and allow it to keep doing what it's doing. Hey, Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So something that I didn't know until recently was that according to a Pew Research study, between 2010 and 2020, there were more people joining the Muslim faith than all non-Muslim religions combined.
Wow, did not know that. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
I bet you don't know which state has no professional sports team. No NFL, no NBA, no LB. And that would be South Carolina.
Didn't know that. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, we were talking about confessionals earlier. Orland, did you know that in Soviet Russia, the KGB used to regularly bug Catholic confessionals and they would eavesdrop, but some priests outsmarted them by offering confessional walks. So you could confess your sins while strolling around a park.
That's a good one. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orland, I'm going to guess that you've never been on the knot.com, but that website is for wedding planning. And according to the Knot, the most popular first dance song for weddings in 2024 was Elvis Presley's Can't Help Falling in Love with You.
That's so sweet.
I got to expand my repertoire here. So, well, thanks so much for that information. Ladies, it was great having you on the show. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.